Good evening. My name is Patrizia McBride, and I am Senior Associate Dean for Social Sciences for the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University. It is my pleasure to welcome students, staff, faculty, and alumni from across the university, as well as members of the public, to the final webinar in our Races in America series. Our year-long series has featured a broad range of scholarship and expertise among Cornell's faculty, considering institutionalized racism from a multidisciplinary perspective. These webinars have been moderated by leading journalists who are actively covering these issues. Throughout this year, we have both deepened our understanding of racism while also exploring potential solutions to its multifaceted consequences. We are encouraged by the enthusiasm of our audience at each of these webinars and thankful that you can be with us tonight. We're also grateful for the wide support we have received for this series from the university leadership, university relations, alumni affairs and development, and eCornell. I also want to thank our partner for this event, the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and our faculty participants for the deep insight and expertise they will share with us tonight. This series is made possible through a partnership with our American Studies program under the directorship of Noliwe Rooks, the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor in the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell. Unfortunately, Noliwe could not be here tonight to introduce this event, but we are eternally grateful for her guidance throughout this series. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Tracy Jan, a reporter for the Washington Post, covering the intersection of race and the economy, a beat she launched in December 2016 that encompasses racial economic disparities, immigration, housing policy, and other stories that hold businesses and politicians accountable for their decisions and promises. Thanks for being with us tonight, Tracy. And now I turn the evening over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in our final Racism in America series. Tonight, we will focus on the economy, which, frankly, underpins systemic racial inequality in this country from the time of its founding. I write about the intersection of race and the economy at the Washington Post, where a team of colleagues and I spent months last year reporting on systemic racism through the life of George Floyd. We examined the role racism played in housing, education, health, and the criminal justice system, denying Floyd, or Perry as his family called him, economic opportunity at every turn. Tonight, we have an esteemed panel of Cornell University experts here who will speak in more detail about how economic policies shape inequality in America. I am sure you all have plenty of questions for them, so please feel free at any time to submit your questions by clicking on the link at the bottom of your screen. I too am eager to hear from the panelists, who will each spend 3 minutes each on opening statements now before we get into a conversation. First up is Erica Groshan, Senior Economics Advisor at the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Dr. Groshan is a labor economist who also served as Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Thank you, Jan, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be a member of this panel with my distinguished colleagues. To kick off, what I want to do is review some large and persistent racial disparities in economic outcomes. And then I want to point out that a prerequisite for improving social equity is better official statistics, because those are what are going to help us understand these inequities and to guide policy going forward. So next chart. This chart, I have 3 charts. This first one looks at labor force participation for Black and white people ages 25 to 54. This shows the share who are in the labor force over 40 years, starting in 1979, going through 2019, up to the pandemic. The blue lines are for men, the dotted ones are for white men, and the solid blue line is for Black men. And what you can see is that Black men's labor force participation has lagged below that of white men for this entire time, and there was essentially no conversion over this period of time, conversions over this period of time. This large economic difference is associated with the kind of systemic racism that you've been hearing about in this series: differences in hiring practices, education, access to education, the criminal justice system, healthcare, housing, wealth, and more. No such racial disparity is readily noticeable for women, but let's look at wages in the next slide. This, again, the lines mean the same thing. The dotted blue line is white men. The solid blue line is Black men. And the same for the red lines for women. And this is inflation-adjusted median wages for employed people. You see a large wage difference between Black and white men and between white and Black women. And these have actually widened over the past 40 years, not narrowed. The last chart takes a quick look at what's happened. Next chart, please. Takes a look at what's happened during the recession, or rather during the pandemic. And from the look of it, COVID-19 may well be worsening racial disparities. I show three groups of people here: white, workers in the labor force, Black, and Hispanic. Each of these bars represents the results for 1 month during the pandemic. And the length of the bars shows you what share of the previous year's labor force has suffered COVID-19 job disruptions, that is, increases in unemployment, exits from the labor force, or reduced hours. And very quickly, you can see that in every case, for every month, the amount of disruptions that you see for Black and Hispanic workers are larger than the disruptions than you see for white workers. So this is, this is just the tip of the iceberg of the disparities that you can see in the data. The next slide, please. If knowing of the many possible causes, what can we do to address the disparities? The frustrating answer is that it's very hard to know what to do without better data and more research. To design and manage policies to raise equity, we need good measures of outcomes and the conditions that create those inequities. And this cute fellow here is Lord Kelvin of thermometer fame. And he said, and I paraphrase, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So from that point of view, official data are 21st century infrastructure. They will help us get to where we want to go. Next slide. For an idea of what we need to do to make the data worthy to the task at hand, I want to refer you to a conversation that the American Economics Association Statistics Committee recently held on the topic, and they came to two important conclusions. First of all, that data deficiencies are impeding measuring racial disparities and the other effects of systemic racism. Basically, not enough detail, poor coverage, and missing some important questions. But there are fixes that could upgrade these measures, and they talked a lot about those. So let me conclude. Simple statement: we have large, persistent racial differences in economic outcomes that are not disappearing on their own. To address them effectively, we need better official data than we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Groshan. Next, we will hear from Lawrence Glickman, the Stephen Evelyn Millman Professor in American Studies in the Department of History in the College of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you to my co-panelists. Thank you to Cornell and especially Noliwe Rooks for organizing this amazing series that we've had going on this year. And especially thanks to all the people who are listening in and hopefully participating in the conversation tonight. I'm really excited to be a part of it. My remarks today will focus on the prehistory of our present moment of racial capitalism. In my recent book on the idea of free enterprise, I discussed how advocates of free enterprise shaped modern American conservatism. Their enemy was the New Deal of the 1930s and what later came to be called the welfare state. And I believe that they ultimately played an important role in delegitimizing both. They employed tactics that I think are still familiar to us if we follow the nature of modern American conservatism, using what I called in that book elite victimization, in which powerful people claim to be victims, subverting the way things actually are to call themselves the victims. They also use binary, apocalyptic, and slippery slope arguments, claiming that even mild expansions of the safety net would lead ultimately to totalitarian outcomes. Although their arguments were generally of a colorblind variety, they used what I consider to be a racialized freedom-slavery binary to make their arguments. In the process, they described exceptionally privileged people and business firms as unfree and used metaphors of slavery to describe the plight of the business firm and the CEO under New Deal liberal governance. I am currently studying how backlashes have shaped American politics since the end of the American Civil War in 1865. And I've been surprised to find that many of the roots of the development that I believed had their origins in the battle against the New Deal actually can be dated back to Reconstruction. The period from the Civil War ending in 1865 up until 1877 or so. And in this period, the kind of rhetoric that I associate with free enterprise arguments was much more explicitly racialized. During this period, as the radical Republican Congress, African American citizens, and others tried to develop an interracial democracy, we can find the origins of much of the language of modern conservatism in the backlash against it. It was rooted in white supremacy and a rejection of equal rights for African Americans, which critics labeled Negro supremacy. It was a language of inversion and self-pity. White Southerners, according to a Memphis newspaper in 1874, faced, quote, the most insulting and unjust tyranny to which a race of people has ever been subjected. This is less than 10 years after the end of chattel slavery in the United States, ending in 1865, to give you a sense of the language that you find. One surprisingly modern element in the backlash against Reconstruction that I've been researching is what we might call a 19th century taxpayer revolt. This is an argument that taxes were paying too much in taxes to support a system that oppressed them. This is the argument they make again and again. The language that they often use is that these taxes were forcing Negro rights down our throats through military occupation, through the Freedmen's Bureau, and other means. Such language, I think, really sets the template for future backlashes, and especially the backlash against the civil rights movement, where you find very similar language about how unbearable taxation, federal bayonets, cramming down our throats, and so forth, that taxation is being used to oppress people who generally were the most powerful in society. As these comments suggest, what I'm finding is that a lot of white opponents of Reconstruction were not really interested in the question of national prosperity. They were interested in maintaining racial hierarchy. One 1873 couplet, I think, is quite really on point here, and it said, this is from a Southern newspaper, better the bed of straw and crust of bread than the Negro's head heel upon the white man's head. The idea is better for white people to live in an interracial democracy. And this brings me to the concluding point I want to make, which is that racial capitalism values hierarchy and subjugation, what politicians unapologetically called white supremacy, more than collective wealth and flourishing. And that's a price I think we're still paying. I want to recommend a book that I recently read by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, which is precisely about not just the social justice costs, but the really economic cost to our society of Jim Crow segregation and its lingering after effects. And the broader point that I think my study shows is that a more egalitarian society is also likely to be a more collectively wealthier society. Thank you very much.
All right, did it again. Thank you so much, Professor. We now turn to Riche Richardson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you so much, Ms. Tracy Jan. And I want to thank my fellow panelists this evening, American Studies, including my colleague, Noliwe Rooks, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the audience tuning in. I want to begin by drawing on my recent book, Emancipation's Daughters, Reimagining Black Femininity and the National Body, whose introduction incorporates archival research materials related to the Aunt Jemima advertising trademark from the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University to connect the commodification of Black bodies in American advertising to the problem of racism and economics that we're examining this evening. In the aftermath of the Charleston tragedy that took the lives of Reverend Clemente Pinckney and 8 other parishioners at Mother Emanuel AME Church in 2015, in which the perpetrator invoked the Confederate flag as a rationale for his violent attack, I was invited to contribute to the Room for Debate forum in the New York Times on the question of other symbols that should be reconsidered. In my op-ed entitled, "Can We Please Finally Get Rid of Aunt Jemima?" I drew on this study, which was then in development, to urge a rethinking of the Aunt Jemima image in light of its roots in the plantation nostalgia of the South and romance linked to the mammy stereotype. It astonished me that exactly 5 years to the day after the Charleston tragedy, NBC Universal contacted me for an interview because of that op-ed to revisit the very same issues, as the debate about symbols resurfaced with even more intensity after George Floyd's death in the midst of the widespread protests. The various interviews that circulated to the Today Show, the NBC Nightly News, and various other media outlets focused on PepsiCo's announcement of its decision to change the name and image associated with its Aunt Jemima brand after the singer Kirby questioned it in a TikTok video. Such recent critiques served as the latest within a long-standing one of the Aunt Jemima, including by numerous visual artists of the Black arts movement during the 1960s. In February, the name was indeed changed to the name Pearl Milling Company, reflecting the early roots of the ready-made pancake mix, juxtaposed with an image of a mill and water wheel. While some have questioned the changes and wrongly implied her to be an image of Black women's empowerment, it is crucial to understand that Aunt Jemima was a national spectacle and fiction who was hyper-embodied and lacked a voice, other than the one linked to the identity that her various performers fictionalized over time, which drew on the mammy stereotype steeped in antebellum slavery. Over time, her citation overshadowed the concrete and real contributions of iconic Black women of the 20th century and into the new millennium examined in my book, including national leaders such as Mary McLeod Bethune. It's astonishing how long this image, rooted in minstrelsy, endured after Chris Rutt and Charles Underwood adopted it as a logo in 1889, which was bought by Quaker Oats during the mid-1920s and enacted by multiple Black women performers across its long history, circulated and marketed in relation to various products in American material culture, and updated over time. Her marketing reflected the long-standing problem of commodifying and branding Black bodies for profit within the capitalist system, which is, like Aunt Jemima, rooted in slavery. It is not only important to question the investments in commodifying such racial stereotypes steeped in Southern nostalgia, but to also understand the linkages between persisting commodification of such advertising trademarks and the lack of adequate inclusion and diversity in corporate work environments. This Aunt Jemima stereotype based on the mammy is also problematic because of how much it anchors images such as the matriarch that have inflected and informed aspects of U.S. policymaking, such as Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report on the Negro family. It was designed to address causal relationships between poverty and Black families, but played a role in pathologizing Blacks. Other race and gender stereotypes have also been similarly invoked to pathologize economically disadvantaged Blacks over time, such as the so-called welfare queen of the 1980s and baby mama of the Obama era. All of this points to the real-world consequences of stereotypes. While Black poverty has been routinely pathologized in this nation, the privileged have not necessarily fared much better, spanning back to the era when notions of Black respectability grounded discourses of Black uplift at the end of the 19th century. Ida B. Wells had famously discussed the backlash against Black economic progress after slavery ended and linked it to the rise of lynching during that period, which escalated after Reconstruction ended and peaked by 1890, a period of reaction when white race rioting became routine as a strategy to intimidate Blacks and foreclose their social, economic, and political progress. In my first book on Black masculinity in the South, I studied archival resources related to war policy, such as disposal of the colored drafted men within the War Plans Division, which consigned Black soldiers from the South to labor battalions, and drawing on the culture of convict leasing linked them to disease and lower intelligence. Yet, even the preferred Black troops from the North had limited opportunities and mobility within a segregated military, as indicated in one of the main points of a work that I analyzed, Charles Fuller's A Soldier's Play, in a line uttered by Sergeant Vernon Waters, "And they'll still hate you, regardless of how well you talk, walk, dress, or how the rank." Indeed, the incident experienced by Lieutenant Karen Nazario speaks volumes, who was pepper sprayed during a traffic stop in Virginia recently, in emphasizing even the precarity of Blacks who have achieved success and rank within a society premised on racial stratification and income inequality.
Thank you so much. And now, finally, we turn to Tajaswi Nagaraja, Assistant Professor of History in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations.
Thank you, Tracy, and I want to thank all the organizers and co-panelists for facilitating this conversation. As we face this moment, the sort of 2021 moment, we all want to be able to predict the future of the election and policy and where things are headed. And historians are not able to predict the future, but what we can do is sort of trace the dynamics from past eras. And what I want to do is present a comparison to exactly 75 years ago, the 1945-1946 moment, as compared to 2020, 2021. This was a post-war moment, the transition from World War II to the post-war. And 2021 has been narrated also as a post-war moment, from the war-like crisis of the Trump presidency and white nationalism, the pandemic, which has been compared to World War II, and the George Floyd uprising and national reckoning over the war at home in the form of mass incarceration policing. And activists in policymakers for racial and economic justice in this 1946 moment, 75 years ago, and activists and policymakers now see these as sort of a crisis opportunity moment where racial policy and economic policy are inextricably linked. Again, using this sort of racial capitalism analysis that we're bringing to the table. The 1946 moment was marked by a wave of anti-Asian violence against Japanese Americans returning to their homes, a wave of anti-Semitism and resentment towards Jewish people for the context of World War II, and a wave of both police violence and rioting and lynching white supremacists against returning Black veterans. Many leaders in these movements, and even the presidents of the times, FDR and Harry Truman, And a future president, Ronald Reagan, in 1946, said we have to look at the fascism of our own, the Nazism that is homegrown in America, and how to confront that. Black activists and labor activists in the interracial labor movement saw linking in racial and economic justice, linking Black freedom with economic justice for all as necessary to hold back against that homegrown fascism and to create a post-war order that met the promise of military service. And you see other echoes of that period, an attempt to break unions into the South through the Operation Dixie campaign, as we have now attempt to break unions into the South, we saw with Amazon, and a wave of civil rights protests. And so these issues were linked in the eyes of Black civil rights activists and labor activists. The fight for racial justice and Black-specific dignity and rights, as well as an interracial economic justice agenda, advancing the New Deal, advancing unionization, and an attempt to see that the way this racial capitalist stratification would be used specifically to harm Black and other non-white people, but also to degrade economic justice for all, right? As long as there would be a racial divide in pay, there would be a gender divide in pay, and also a regional divide, keeping the South non-union, keeping the South low wage. This would be used to depress wages and dignity for all. And you see echoes from then to now, the way people claiming that experience. Riche mentioned the Karen Nazario experience, right, of this lieutenant who served in the military. And we know how the cases of Philando Castile and Breonna Taylor, essential workers in healthcare and education, killed by the police. And that narrative of essential workers now was also part of how service members and defense workers asserted their claim to that post-war order. And now you're seeing particularly healthcare workers, but other essential workers, asserting that post-war claim. We served our country in the pandemic, and we demand racial and economic justice. In that period, it was often in the armed forces and in defense industries and masculinized jobs, aircraft factories and otherwise. Now we have especially these industries that are seen as care industries, like healthcare and education, as these frontline industries of national service, often industries that have had degraded labor markets because of race and gender segmentation, and a necessity to recognize these as jobs to the benefit of all. That post-war outcome was a mixed bag. There were certain gains for labor and civil rights movements, but new sites of refashioned and retrenched inequality took shape. Even as gains in the wage equality were gained along lines of race, sites of inequality in housing and finance and the welfare state and the credit, the realm of credit, created new inequalities. And as we know, these echo into the era of mass incarceration. And those realms of infrastructure and value refashioned inequalities, even as political equal rights and even the right to equal wages gained ground. So just as that 1940s moment was sort of a crossing for the future of race and class inequality and equality, and the 1960s moment would be as well, in the current policymaking movement, we can see how that's playing out. And I hope we'll talk more about that. Riche talked about that service member claims making, and Larry talked about that Reconstruction context. And you have a conversation now about a Green New Deal from that 30s and 40s moment, and a third Reconstruction from that second Reconstruction moment, linking racial and economic justice for the benefit of those most dishonored, but also to hold back the most dangerous threats to our democracy and to advance economic justice for all. And we can talk more about the current policy climate. That would be great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, professors, for those very valuable insights. Just a reminder to those watching that you should feel free to submit your questions at any time by clicking on the link at the bottom of your screen. Now let's get deeper into this discussion. I'd like to start by talking about how the coronavirus pandemic has laid bare the stark racial economic inequalities in the United States. We have people in white-collar jobs able to work from home, save money even, and they're spending it now on home remodels, planning their post-pandemic vacations, While a huge swath of America, disproportionately women of color, lost their jobs as the hospitality and tourism industries shut down last year. Dr. Groshan, can you kick us off by speaking in more detail about how the COVID-induced recession is worsening these racial income and wealth gaps?
Sure. You really hit the nail on the head that a large share of the workers were able to continue to do their work from home, had the same income and job security that they had had before. But at the spectrum, you had where the wages were lowest, you also had primarily people who could not do their work from home and who faced the choice, many of them, of either go into work and endanger their lives and those of their family, or stay home and not have an income to support their families. Right. So this was a very different set of choices for people. And you can see this, you can certainly see this in the data. Interestingly enough, if you look at just women and look for evidence that the recession was more difficult for women, it won't jump out at you. You have to divide it into the racial groups to see that the people who really had the difficult problem, the women who had the difficult problem, were primarily African American and Hispanic women. So this is just a case where where the disparities just became much more glaring. Most of the layoffs early on were temporary layoffs where people were recalled, but now these are being converted more and more to permanent layoffs, and we have a big increase in long-term unemployment, people without an attachment to their employer. And those are primarily people in these occupations that we've been talking about, the ones that have a lot of turnover and are low pay and are ones where work was unstable to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Well, given the hell of a year we just had, the world just went through, some have expressed optimism that this pandemic could be a wake-up call to finally address long-entrenched issues like racial economic inequality. There's certainly the pressure to do so, given the mass protests over police brutality and racial injustice that have occurred across the nation in the wake of George Floyd's murder. The Biden administration has made massive investments in the social safety net as part of its economic rescue plan, and has promised to do everything in its power to dismantle systemic racism by making equity central to all of its policies. I'm curious what our panelists think need to happen next in order to turn that from wishful thinking into a reality. What does it mean to put $1 trillion into the economy, and how can doing so actually fight racism? Dr. Glickman, let's start with you. You mentioned Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, and the argument that racism is economically costly. But this country's capitalistic roots lie in racial oppression. So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah, that's the big question, I think. One thing that I find encouraging as a historian is that as someone who studies backlashes, very often we are told that backlashes will be inevitable. Whenever there's a movement for social justice, demands for equality, that there will be a backlash. And one of the really striking things to me about this summer is that in the wake of the George Floyd protests, there really wasn't much of a backlash. And that just shows that backlashes have to be constructed, have to be carried out. They're not inevitable. Similarly, the idea that most of us have been imbued with by free market rhetoric is that government spending is wasteful, it robs the taxpayer, and so forth. And I think what we're seeing is much more of a sense that public goods matter to all of us. They matter in the struggle for racial justice, but they also matter in terms of making our society a healthier society, a more just society, a society where the kind of divisions that are tearing us apart might be reduced. So I see long-held assumptions about backlash and about what government can and can't do being questioned. That doesn't mean that those things are going to win out because we're a very divided country. But I think they're much more on the table as a result of the pandemic and associated events than they've been for some time.
Okay. Well, Dr. Nagaraja, you spoke about how a crisis moment such as the one we're living in now can be a potentially transformative opportunity. Previous government efforts to transform society, I'm thinking of promises of the GI Bill and the New Deal, have helped lift white Americans into the middle class, but the promises were never fully realized for Black Americans. Can race-neutral policies and politics work today? And how can advocates of race and class equality push change that directly addresses the structural underpinnings of today's racist economic systems? Or could all of these new government investments further entrench racial economic inequality?
That's a really important question. I think what we're going to see is a mix of, and what it might be valuable to see is a mix of universal policies which strengthen a notion of a common good, of economic justice for all, as well as universal policies that have a targeted universalism aspect, that have a racial justice emphasis, as well as a third piece, racial justice focused policies and even reparations policies. And I think that what might be most effective is a dynamic among those. What we've seen with the $1.9 trillion stimulus is that certain things that can have a racial justice impact are built into some of these proposals and subsequent ones. For example, the funding of mobile crisis teams as an alternative to policing, and the emphasis on a care economy, right, that can have a sort of race and gender equity element. But we also absolutely need, Larry mentioned McGee and some of the work on targeted universalism and a conscious effort to see how the material infrastructure of these policies are made. Any housing policy will be discriminatory. It absolutely will be discriminatory if it operates based on the dominant notion of credit scores, based on the dominant notion of home values, which is racialized, not only in the era of Jim Crow, but more recently as scholars like Destin Jenkins and Keonga Taylor have written about in recent years. And any infrastructure policy needs to be very attentive to specifically the way that these things will affect the built environment, right? And as these will be administered through state and municipal governments, and as local actors will play a role in these events. And you have groups and activists, just as, I'm writing about 1940s civil rights and labor activists from that World War II greatest generation. You have activists today in the policymaking, especially, from the squad section of policymaking, articulating that link, that racial capitalism analysis, and people like McGee and others, and think tanks like the Action Center for Race and the Economy that are looking at those policies, both for a justice for all vision and a specific racial justice emphasis. And I think housing policy in particular, and the way infrastructure affects that, and the anti-carceral emphasis and active measures to see a transition away from mass incarceration, something which affects not only 2.4 million people incarcerated at one time, but tens of million people who have a range of stigmas and disenfranchisements related to it. We need a just transition, just like a climate transition and a foreign policy transition and an energy transition. We need a just transition that attends to that. And that is a racial justice measure, but it's going to benefit Black, other non-white, and many white people too, who've experienced this 3-decade, 4-decade punitive state.
That's right. A lot of people with records, criminal records, can't get housing, they can't get jobs, they can't even get licenses, professional licenses.
Absolutely. And that echoes some of that GI Bill double edge in this mass incarceration era.
I want to bring in an audience question based on what you just said. Someone wanted us to go into greater detail about how credit can contribute to economic inequality and wealth disparity between races in the United States. Someone want to take that?
Well, the sum total of a lifetime of workplace discrimination and not having a good education is having less wealth, right? And and when you have less wealth, you have less credit. So if everything is based on whether or not your parents and the generations before have accumulated wealth that you have access to and others don't, then you'll have far more opportunities than those without credit. So for example, we have a credit system now that's much more based on whether or not you paid back loans like mortgages than being based on whether or not you paid your electricity bill on time, right? To have a mortgage, you have to have wealth, but you don't necessarily to have electricity. So there would be ways of changing the credit system that acknowledge people's abilities to meet their bills, even if they were not based on having loans to begin with and based on having wealth to begin with.
That's good.
I would just add quickly that discriminatory lending policies are were a central part of Jim Crow. Denial of crop loans, for example, to African-American farmers who tried to register to vote was a very common disfranchisement tactic, both in the Reconstruction era and in the era of the modern civil rights movement. And, we all know about the history of redlining and other discriminatory financial setbacks that African Americans and other people of color have faced. So, that whole financial system is very much connected with what we're talking about.
And even the way credit is evaluated today with artificial intelligence, they're supposedly race neutral, but there are racial biases factored in. So this is still very much a modern day issue. The protests across the country that have gotten worldwide attention have not only pushed politicians to address systemic racism, they've driven corporations in every industry to make all sorts of promises and changes as it relates to their practices. As Dr. Richardson mentioned earlier, PepsiCo had dropped its Aunt Jemima branding on its pancake mix because it was based on racial stereotypes of the Black mammy. Uncle Ben's Rice has changed its name to Ben's Original, and the cream of wheat brand of porridge, which has for more than a century featured a smiling Black man that calls to mind Jim Crow era stereotypes of subservience, said last year it's also reviewing its packaging. Dr. Richardson, what do you think of these efforts of Aunt Jemima's new name, Pearl Milling Company, and image, and why have some Americans remained invested in racial stereotypes as commodities?
Thank you so much. It's amazing. It was unprecedented to witness protests in all 50 states in this nation, as well as in cities around the world. And in the wake of the horrific and tragic loss of George Floyd, there was a lot of hope about possibilities for change. And we definitely saw that response across so many different institutions, including within higher education. It seemed that it was a moment that engendered a lot of self-reflection about becoming more diverse, more inclusive. And the corporate brands that gave up the stereotypical images very much were at the center of driving that conversation, even though I think it's really crucial to raise questions about why on earth did it take so long for PepsiCo to actually divest of the symbol like Aunt Jemima, when considering that the critique has long been there. It didn't start yesterday. And so that such a horrific tragedy ended up being the tipping point toward making a real shift speaks volumes. One of the things that I've been concerned about, especially as so many monuments have come down in so many places, part of me really would prefer a slow conversation about some of those things rather than a fast conversation, because often I think in just overnight shifts, we miss a lot of nuances. But it's significant that in some cases the changes have been more cosmetic, like the moment, came and went. And I don't think the soul searching went deep enough in the case of some corporate environments, because it's not just about the symbols. It's easy to make surface and cosmetic changes, but maybe harder to talk about questions of inclusivity in work cultures, difference and diversity in work cultures, and then also dealing with maybe some of the microaggressions that minorities and especially people of color routinely experience on a day-to-day basis in work environments. It's important to think about why so many Americans for so long have remained invested in these very problematic symbols that bear the residue of racism from a long time ago, as well as its continuing impact and the afterlives of slavery. I think that it's in part, like from my perspective of being a researcher, who examined the archives, one of the things that really stood out in looking through the Quaker files was that family was always at the heart of marketing Aunt Jemima, like from decade to decade, really. And those notions of family became even more diverse over time, including the Black family surfacing very saliently in the 1960s. But in the 40s, it was like an image that was very much attached to notions of nuclear family. And so a lot of people are very sentimental about the images and want to hold on to them without understanding the deeper and more problematic implications, including the racial implications.
Right. Well, the audience has a question for you when we're talking about corporations addressing diversity issues and digging deeper into looking within their own corporate culture. What is your take on software company Basecamp's ban on societal and political discussions in their company, except for topics they feel affect their core business? That was announced this week.
Well, I don't think we can get very far when there are glaring and obvious denials of systemic racism when it obviously remains such a reality. And we see that even in our political culture. I mean, most recently we saw Lindsey Graham actually suggest that there's no systemic racism. And a part of it, too, I think very much had to do with President Trump last fall making an assault on critical race theory and guidelines about what should be recognized in corporate environments, including, critical race theory. And so actually banning certain discussions. And so that really set a very problematic standard that has been mirrored and internalized, I think, in a range of work environments. And those decisions and choices set us back. They don't really move us forward, because if we are going to solve a problem, it's important to acknowledge that there is one.
That's a very good point. And another audience member has that exact question. How do we help people understand that white supremacy still exists?
Well, some of it is by looking at the past. So I'm thinking of an article that was published recently that said, we have seen the entry of many more Black people and women occupations that used to be the sole province of white men, right? And if you assume that the innate capacity of all these populations is more or less the same, then you can say, well, how much of the economic growth that we have sustained in the past 60 years is due to better allocation of these human resources than we had before? And they estimate that 20 to 40% of the growth of the U.S. economy in the last 60 years is due to better allocation of human resources into these occupations. So I think some of it is just Look, when we make our society more equitable, we all benefit from it. It's not a cost in the way that it's portrayed by the narrative of, oh, you've restricted me.
Anyone else want to tackle that question?
I wanted to just quickly add that I think Erica is right about how important it is to understand history in this regard, because my students are often surprised when I tell them that, the term white supremacy was used openly as a political goal right through the end of the Jim Crow era into the 1960s even. And the other thing you can do is look at structures of rhetoric, which is what I try to do in my own research. I just was noticing that some people saw Tucker Carlson recently had there's getting some echo here, had a monologue about replacement theory and so forth. And one of the things that was notable about that was how similar it was to what you can find in the past. So I think kind of showing those connections, that we haven't totally escaped those forms of rhetoric, is an important thing to do.
Great one. Yes, Dr. Richardson.
And I would add that it's just important to acknowledge the elephant in the room. We just witnessed an insurrection on the nation's capital. What on earth else was it but a reflection of white supremacy? All of the sloganeering that was captured on live cameras really spoke volumes and told us everything we really need to know about the agenda of those involved. And it really was an agenda invested in turning back the hands of time toward a very unsettling and hierarchical period in the past, premised on difference in others of Blacks. Another part of my work, which is looked at the film Birth of a Nation, grapples with a lot of those questions, all of the anxieties about Black voting rights and what they mean. And especially when we think of something like what happened in Texas, I find this to be utterly horrifying, that there's a cost to the continuing implications of the discourse of states' rights in our political culture. We saw it in the response of the president to the pandemic, where there was that coalition of Southern governors that did not enforce the masking and social distancing advisories from the CDC in so many cases, and then also prioritized reopening businesses. The weaponization of the economy in that moment, I think, is something that we have to grapple with, as well as thinking about what happened in Texas. This recalcitrant attitude that says, well, we're not going to be a part of the federal power grid or whatever, but then this results in literal casualties during the environmental crisis back in February.
Yeah. Dr. Glickman mentioned, this is an audience member has a question for you, Dr. Glickman, that you mentioned that those with power will create narratives where they are victims during a backlash, such as what Dr. Richardson just was addressing. Why has this tactic been so effective?
That's a really terrific question that I've been trying to study for a long time. I think that it is a way of, one of the things that we saw that people commented on a lot is that during the era of Donald Trump's presidency, he was able to sort of corral a kind of populist anger. And we normally associate that with sort of oppressed, virtuous people who've sick of being mistreated and rise up against it. And one of the things that you find among one of the key conservatives' moves is to kind of invert that rhetoric, claim it for themselves. Fannie Lou Hamer famously said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." But you can find so many privileged white people saying the same thing during the civil rights era. Things are going too fast, too far. I'm sick and tired of it. I'm fed up. And there's something about that populist anger that someone like George George Wallace plugged into, that Donald Trump plugged into, that has long been very effective throughout American history. Whether it will continue to be effective in the future is a really interesting question. So I'm afraid I can't quite answer why it works, but all I can say is it has worked periodically throughout our history.
Let's discuss the role of the consumer. Dr. Glickman, can you talk about the use of consumer activism as a political force, especially in the context of civil rights boycotts and boycotts, and how that is relevant today?
Yeah, I think that's really relevant because Americans have always considered consumption a part of their political arsenal of activities, and especially Americans who have some sort of subordinate status in society. It's one of the weapons of power that that Americans have always used. And the civil rights movement, for example, relied a great deal on the threat of consumer boycotts, Montgomery bus boycott being one of the most famous in our history, but there are many, many others. And the idea is that in the aggregate, African Americans, other groups of people who have a subordinate position in society have a lot of aggregate purchasing power. And that their voices can be heard through boycotts or threats of boycotts or rewarding companies that change their behavior, which is what sometimes is called a boycott. So, it's one of the ways that Americans participate in politics. I saw a survey a few years ago, something like 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 Americans said they had, boycotted a product or participated in some form of consumer activism over the previous 3 or 4 years. So I think it's a common tactic, but most effectively used, I think, during the era of civil rights activism.
All these corporations now making statements and promises, it's not just for the social good, it helps their bottom line, right? It helps expand their market share.
Yeah,
Dr. Nagaraja, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, we see a dynamic, and I was going to make exactly that point that you made, Tracy, that, it's not just a top-down sort of marketing question, but there's a dynamic among that sort of consumer pressure. And also, I think what we'll see, and some journalists are emerging, a wave of workplace revolt too in these very industries too. We saw with the Me Too movement and with the Black Lives movement, the way you have in key industries, in the media industry, as well as in the industries we're talking about, as well as the athletic industry, a way that there's worker action taking place, right? And even NBA players use their union and use their union organizing in order to create a dynamic relationship with the consumers and put that pressure. So I think you're going to see these dynamics on questions of racial justice and economic justice as well. And the other thing I would mention, and I think Riche touched on this, is pushing on the symbolic towards more material and structural changes. And I think we're seeing two things. As Larry mentioned, the backlash isn't necessarily working. Many people said 2020 was going to be 1968 with respect to the election and the uprisings. And the verdict is that no, it wasn't. And that creates a certain opening for those that want to advance racial justice, to push against even Joe Biden, who might have taken a more cautious approach and say, I have to respond to the backlash. But certain racial justice activists have been able to say, there wasn't a backlash. You won the election and there wasn't a backlash to the George Floyd uprising. Let's advance these things. And I think that workplace revolt that we're only now understanding is going to continue to be a dynamic to push those things. And you have workers in the tech industry saying, okay, it's great that you put up Black Lives Matter on your website, but our company works with ICE. And our company works with ICE in terms of using surveillance technologies in detention. And so this is a racial justice issue. What's the lines with that? You have racial justice foreign policy issues where you have in the tech industry organized workers at Google saying drone attacks is something that is an issue of racial justice and dignity, and should our company be using technology for those issues? So I think that is a two key dynamics where it just doesn't fit into an old playbook, where the backlash isn't working and where the symbolic is actually being pushed against, and a demand for more material change is coming. And it's not just from the CEOs in the boardrooms, but both consumers and workers in dynamic with each other.
Absolutely. I'd like to delve a little deeper into that, into Dr. Richardson's introductory remarks about the lack of inclusion and diversity in corporate environments and how that relates to the racial wealth gap. What should be the gold standard? And how do we know if a corporation is succeeding in meeting it?
Well, one way to think about it goes back to everything Erica says about numbers and data. It's all in the data, so in a way, I think a quantitative approach, is important for measuring, how, like, the proportions of just workers and grappling with all those questions in a very fine-tuned way. And not necessarily even invoking gender categories very broadly in some instances in assessing the environments. For instance, if we take, say, academia, for instance, and the quoting of statistics about the ratio of, say, male to female, like, full professors, typically what we hear is that women hold 32% of those jobs versus, the male faculty. But if we dig deeper, we see that of that 32%, Black women only make up 2%. And so, there's so many scholars, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, our very own at Cornell, as the founding voice within the discourse of intersectionality. And so it's important, even when we, look at the numbers, that we think intersectionally in establishing our rubrics, or else we can end up missing a lot.
You're setting up my next question so well about data. Expanding beyond corporations to our national economy, how do we measure progress or lack thereof? This pandemic simply shined a spotlight on the underlying structural barriers and inequality that have long existed. Even when Black unemployment was at historic lows, as our former president loved to tout, it was nearly twice that of white unemployment, with people stitching together multiple low-wage jobs, often without benefits, to make ends meet. Dr. Cecilia Rouse, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I were recently discussing whether there should be a better way to measure the health of our economy, not just with the overall unemployment, but against how the most vulnerable workers are faring, as well as how to improve our statistics gathering to better understand whether public investments are reaching all Americans. Dr. Groshan, what are some important things that we can't see well because of our data deficiencies? And is there anything that today's listeners can do to help improve the measurement of racism's impacts?
Great. Well, let me just give you some examples. As Rashay was talking about intersectionality, that's all about focusing on some small groups that are important. This experience is really important, but they are small. And our current surveys just won't have very many people in them in those categories. And so you can't really address many of these questions without using actually administrative data that covers everybody, because that's where you can look at what's going on with the smaller groups. So just to give you an example, I could have drawn a line on these graphs for Asian American workers. If you had done that, the Asian American workers would have looked like everything is fine. Wages are high, labor force participation is high, but we all know that's not the whole story, right? If you divide it up by occupational group or by educational group, you'll see that there are some real problems for Asian Americans who don't have high levels of education, that that you have a bimodal distribution of people in that population, and you can't describe the population by looking at the mean for that group in particular, right? Alaskan and Pacific Islanders are a very important part of the economy in certain parts of the country, but not overall. If you look at national data sets, you're not going to get many of them. In order to understand the impact of policies, you need to have data that really give you the ability to drill down. And you also need to be able to track when jobs are being added or gained, more or less in real time, who is getting these jobs and who is losing those jobs and how to address them. Where do they live and what are their characteristics? And again, without making better use of our administrative data, without having a real effort to improve that data, then you can't answer the questions. You also can't do the convincing work that you need to do that show when a policy or program is working or having unintended consequences without good data. So right now, there are people who are saying, oh, no job training works, things like that. Well, that's clearly not the case, but it does underlie the issue that doing studies of the effectiveness of programs is too expensive, so we don't do it often enough and well enough to be able to say what really works and what doesn't. And instead, you get this narrative that, oh, job training doesn't work. So you also asked, how can we help, right? So here's an important thing. There are three things that every listener in this group, in the audience can actually do right now. The first thing is that it is important to participate in federal surveys. It's a really important public service that you provide every time you respond when you're selected to be part of the current population survey, the American Community Survey. Participating in those surveys is what informs policy better than anything else. And so I really encourage everybody to do that. A response rate, particularly household response rates, are falling, that people should participate in them and convince others to do so. And they should also make sure that their employers are participating in those surveys, because again, that's important. So that will uphold the quality of the data. The second thing is, of course, to vote for representatives who will support the statistical agencies that are trying to do this work and provide it to everybody. So understanding whether or not your representatives are supportive of this work is really crucial, because the BLS had its real budget decline by 15% during the years that I was there, right? Because of so much squeezing on this on the budgets of the agencies. And then finally, another thing you can do is join some of the groups that actually work actively to support the statistical system. So there's a group that I chair, the Friends of BLS. Anybody can join, it's free. What you do, the main activity that you'll engage in is actually signing on to letters to appropriators saying, look, this really matters, and it matters to us for this reason. So this data and this information is really crucial to shaping the kind of narratives that you heard today by Shez, the narratives that Tej was telling us about, that Riche, that Larry was talking about. How do we shape these narratives? What you write about, Tracy, it's by having some of this information to say, no, it's not a figment of our imagination or irrational anger. Here are the facts.
Exactly. I was just going to say, data gives us facts. And some would say it's such a drab thing to talk about. It's not very sexy, but I would like to make the argument that it's actually could be a matter of life and death. When you have economic groups being pitted against each other economically, people make assumptions. You're talking about Asian Americans, the stereotype that they're doing so well when measured as a full group, but you don't break it down into ethnicities. The diaspora is so large, but the numbers themselves are small. that you don't see the fact that they are the most disparate, widening in terms of income inequality, racial group in the United States. And, people are getting killed. People can't tell the difference between a Japanese person in the 80s during the Auto Wars or a Chinese person. And Vincent Chin was killed for that. And today you see all these hate crimes being committed against Asian Americans, anyone who looks Asian, without, knowing whether they're from China. Not that that makes them any rightful target because of the way the president spoke about the coronavirus, but it is dangerous without the data. The typical white family today has 8 times the wealth of a typical Black family, according to the Federal Reserve, for all sorts of systemic reasons, including the neighborhoods in which we live, which dictates the schools we attend, the opportunities we have, our interactions with police, even our mental and physical health. But even if one has made it, there are limits of Black privilege. Wealth does not shield one from racism. Dr. Nagaraja, the protests after George Floyd's murder has made policing and incarceration concerns even more central to our national conversations. Can you elaborate on the connections between criminal justice and economic justice?
Absolutely. The carceral stigma and the connection of relationship to the criminal justice stigma to racism has a long history. As I write about from the 1940s World War II era, when people experienced the military justice system and related dishonorable discharges, through the 60s and through the contemporary post-60s era of mass incarceration. This relates to your question about data. Part of this task, and this is a longer contribution of racial justice movements from the era of Reconstruction to the New Deal era to civil rights, is the need to focus on certain key sectors, racialized sectors, as well as economic sectors, in order to tell that bigger picture, right? And this idea from the Black Lives Movement, the idea that if we have justice for Black people, if Black people are free, then everybody will be free. And similarly, this idea that there are always certain sectors, whether it's in the armed forces or people incarcerated, which we don't really capture in the unemployment rate fully, right? Or people who are identified as not actively seeking a job anymore, so they're not captured in the unemployment rate. So you do have some of that push, and some of this comes out of civil rights movement energies. I have a colleague, David Stein, who writes about the 1940s energies through the high civil rights movement, and how Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's widow, won the Humphrey Hawkins Act in the 1970s, which enshrined a responsibility of the Fed to reduce unemployment and to track disparities, including racial disparities in unemployment. And so now you see some voices in the Biden DOL and in the Fed, and with those push from Black Lives groups saying we need records on employment disparities based on race. Ayanna Pressley has taken that up. She wrote an op-ed with David Stein, and also capturing the tens of millions of people who've experienced criminal justice stigma, right? Not just people who are incarcerated, but on the outside too. And like I said, I think to address this transition, we need to see this as a transition. Just as we're doing with climate and energy, we have the United Mine Workers coming out and saying coal is not the future this week. I mean, there's an enormous breakthrough in this policy moment. And we need to have some of those kinds of conversations about policing and incarceration and what is a just transition. If there are sectors, especially rural areas where prisons have become an employer, what kind of just transition we can look at in those places. And it's going to require racial justice policies, right? If we have policies that say we're going to end the drug war, we also need a just transition to say, as we have in some states, that people who have been harmed by the war on drugs need to have economic opportunities, frontline economic opportunities in marijuana industry and otherwise. And similarly, this is going to cut across universalist policies. We know that Medicaid expansion, a universalist policy, was a major inroad against mass incarceration because people coming out of prison in Louisiana were able to access a whole array of services, helping to lower the incarceration rate in Louisiana. So healthcare and recognition of care and public health, which you are seeing in the Biden stimulus and policies, this notion that care is infrastructure, this notion that public health is infrastructure, can be very important. And it can link up formerly incarcerated people and their loved ones who've been affected by the criminal justice system in peer jobs, in new sectors of the economy that value public health. And we know that actually, this is the labor-intensive industries of our times, right? Not necessarily making airplanes, but the labor-intensive industries of our times are the kind of jobs that Philando Castile was doing, working in a school, that Breonna Taylor was doing as a medical worker. And valuing these jobs benefits workers, and it benefits the community for these kinds of futures. And we see some of that with a push from the Black Lives Movement, and we have some policy wins already on that front.
Yeah, I spent several months following a man who had left prison. He'd been there for many, many years, most of his adult life, and he's also a recovering addict. So he's trying to get into the counseling, drug and alcohol counseling labor market. But there is an occupational licensing barrier for people with criminal records to enter that. And so these are, who better to be a peer counselor in drug and alcohol than someone who's been through it? But again, this is a hurdle.
There's a project that I've been working on or helping some people with here at Cornell that's addressing just a small part of it, but it shows how important it is to pay attention to all of these issues. Criminal records are a mess. So it turns out if you have a brush with the law, there's a chance your one brush will show up as 4 different events because they repeat the same information over and over again, or things that are supposed to be expunged are still there, or the information is unclear. And employers rely on this information and make decisions that are really to the detriment of a lot of workers. And this is something that could be fixed, right? This is something that's straightforward, but without the intention, it just exacerbates an already terrible problem.
That's right. I want to get to some audience questions before we run out of time here tonight. Back to holding corporations accountable. Should companies publish their DEI metrics much like they share their financial reports? And if so, how do you drive this as a national standard? As a business reporter who covers race, it's maddening because the EEOC reports are not necessarily public, and companies have all sorts of ways of massaging their numbers on their websites. What do you guys think should be the solution?
Benchmarking is used in so many other circumstances. Why wouldn't we want to have clear benchmarks in this case as well?
Like national benchmarks, right?
Yep. Back to Lord Kelvin. You can't manage what you don't measure.
A lot of times companies throw in, if you're talking about worker diversity, they throw in their retail folks with their technologists, so it's especially for these tech companies, it's very difficult sometimes to figure out what kind of progress is being made.
Yeah, it is complicated because there's so much outsourcing activity as well. And so you can imagine strategic choices about what to outsource for that same reason.
One other audience question, and then I want to get to some of our closing remarks. The pandemic had accelerated data science. Can you comment on the inherent bias in how racism enters into AI? Are our point of views made explicit?
Just very quickly, what AI does is aim to replicate what people do, but faster, right? So if there are inherent biases in the decisions that hiring managers or people making promotions or anything else have been doing, then AI will just replicate those very same biases. So it's not written into the code. except in the sense that it takes a lot of activities without questioning and can replicate exactly the same problems that were in place before you had the AI process.
Mm-hmm. Just so we don't come away from this evening too hopeless to even attempt to tackle this very large problem, can you each say one thing, an intervention, an idea perhaps, that is working or that has the promise of moving us forward? And how hopeful are you? And we don't have to discuss data again. We know collecting data would be a good step forward. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Richardson?
Well, one thing that really gives me hope is the current wave of so many activists, for instance, who are making a difference and who are leveraging various platforms to amplify their voices and working at the grassroots levels in very effective and sustained ways. And I think this is a cross-generational dynamic. Spelman sister, Stacey Abrams, is just really making extraordinary contributions to helping the political culture move forward by encouraging more voter participation and accountability when it comes to questions of voting rights. And so these are what I really think of from my own research standpoint as part and parcel of the Now 7 studies. But, she urges us to remember that our time is now. It's like now is the time to really work to make a difference.
That's right. Dr. Glickman?
I think during times of change, what we see is things that seem natural are suddenly seen to be man-made or people-made. And I think we're seeing that in so many areas of society. Things that we just sort of accepted, they kind of have to be this way. I think the pandemic sort of showed us that maybe they don't. And a lot of things that were unseen are now being seen and looked at in new ways. Think about the whole issue of essential labor and how society thought about essential labor 3 or 4 years ago versus today, when we realized the people who kept our country going during the worst of the pandemic were generally people very poorly paid, often people of color, many women in healthcare, in retail, and so forth. And so I feel like there is a way in which a lot of things are up for grabs that we didn't used to talk about. And I think that's a really, really healthy thing in terms of all the, big issues we have. Is that it really helps if you think things could be different rather than, gosh, what can we do about it? That's just the way things are. Tej has been talking a lot about mass incarceration. I think that's another area where not that long ago, there was kind of a general a culture-wide sort of sense that this is just the way things are. Now really a lot of people are asking questions about whether this system really makes sense. So I'm hopeful about the questions that we're asking.
Great. Dr. Groshan?
Yeah, I'm encouraged by the focus on skill-based hiring that a lot of employers are thinking about and being pushed. There's a group called Opportunity at Work that says if we had a better way to identify skills that workers already have and are showing on the job so that they could be promoted and advanced for having those skills and not relying just on whether or not you have a college degree or a credential, but what are the skills that people are already displaying, and have employers really much more focus on if someone is doing X job well, then probably they could do this job well too. That then we could see much more mobility than we have in the past. We've had very rigid mobility, real limitations to mobility because the hiring has been likely way too rigid in the past. If we opened that up, we could get much more diversity into a number of the occupations and see much more mobility in people's career paths than we're seeing now. We have too many glass lead ceilings.
Right.
How do we open those up? I'm really encouraged by the work that Opportunity at Work and some others thinking along those lines are doing.
Dr. Nagaraja.
Yeah, we've talked about these moments, the sort of 1860s and 70s Reconstruction moment, the 1930s, 40s New Deal, civil rights movement of the 60s. And part of what happened and allowed for certain breakthroughs was a certain clarity and a certain polarization, a certain sense of what the stakes were. And I do think the Black Lives Movement, as well as on the other hand, the way that a certain kind of white supremacist politics mobilized by the previous president has said that sort of the center cannot hold, that we cannot just go forward as usual. And a notion that which harms certain groups, eventually those harms echo outwards. And you have people who worked, for example, in the Obama administration saying, we could have done things differently in that 2009 moment. And the way that certain policy regimes like subprime loans, like mass incarceration, which targeted Black and other groups, eventually affected larger sectors, including non-Black groups, subprime mortgages, as well as mass incarceration, and the sense that police violence, and a sort of impunity for police can harm larger and larger sectors. So I think that breakthrough is forcing a certain reckoning, and that lack of 1968 backlash, so to speak. I think the footholds for essential work and care work, and that claim, that what I presented as sort of a claim of, we served society and we have certain claims, is going to take place and going to be key for racialized and gendered sectors, especially in these caring professions, to make claims. And they will have a short window of time to make those claims on policy in terms of valuing racialized and gendered care work. And the last thing I'll say is that, just as I mentioned, that 45 to 46 moment, Medgar Evers comes home from, he's in Normandy, and he comes home and leads a voting rights march in 1946. Other labor and Black activists of all racial backgrounds lead these social movements that echo into the 50s and especially the 60s from that moment. And I think a lot of people that were affected by this pandemic and George Floyd moment, their lives were transformed, and they are going to transform the next decade or two through policymaking and through activism in ways that journalists like Tracy can catch glimpses of now, and historians are going to be writing 20 years from now, 40 years from now, about people that were transformed by the George Floyd moment, by the anti-Trump moment, and by the pandemic, and had a generational transformation for the 2020s, for the 2030s.
Thank you so much for leaving us on that brighter note. I am seeing so many amazing audience questions that I didn't get to. I'm actually going to save the chat and send it to you just to have, or perhaps to make good op-ed pieces, ideas for op-ed pieces. I want to thank the audience members for spending your Tuesday evening with us. For more fascinating, important conversations about systemic racism, please check out the previous 4 webinars covering health, protest movements, education and housing, and policing and incarceration on the Racism in America website at as.cornell.edu. There you'll also find reference materials and further reading on these issues. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.